Hey guys, this is for the sophomores. Hope you all had a nice weekend. Today we're going to talk about the end of Reconstruction and how that happened. Reconstruction had some enormous successes, right? You know, we had the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. We had black people being given citizenship, being given the right to vote in the South. Actually getting elected to office. So there were enormous successes, but despite all this, or maybe because of the successes, we also experienced, okay, because of those successes, we actually had an enormous backlash in the South. A lot of people in the South just did not want Reconstruction. In fact, the vast majority of white Southerners just did not want Reconstruction to continue. So the end of Reconstruction came gradually. Um, we had years of Southern resistance to continued Reconstruction, despite the fact that President Grant continued supporting Reconstruction pretty wholeheartedly, to his credit. But there were a lot of outside events that were really distracting a lot of Americans from Reconstruction. So we had big business booming. This was the beginning of the Gilded Age. We had an economic depression, a very serious one, hit the country in 1873, the Panic of 1873, that lasted 5 years. It was probably the worst depression the country had known up to that time. And then we had a whole debate after that about whether we should inflate the currency by just printing more money. People who supported that position were known as the greenbacks because paper money is green. Also, there were people who said, well, we should back up the money with silver because there's a lot more silver than there is gold. While people who were more conservative economically, including President Grant, who really didn't really understand much about economics, but was kind of convinced to back a resumption of the gold standard, to back up the money with gold. So we had that going on. We had just a general feeling in the North that why are we still doing this? Why are we still down south? Why are we still dealing with what they called, not very nicely, but the Negro question or the Southern question or carpetbag government? People were just tired of it. We certainly know today, and this is maybe more true today, but it was true back in the day as well. People have short attention spans, and people just get tired of things after a while. And then we had President Grant, the corruption, the administration. So he was losing a lot of credibility when he wanted to advance other priorities. So it was really just a gradual erosion of support for Reconstruction in the North, and we had solid opposition to Reconstruction in the South. So those two things didn't bode well for the success of Reconstruction. In 1874 congressional elections, the Democrats won control of the House of Representatives, and we know the Democratic Party was opposed to Reconstruction. Interestingly, though, right before that Congress took over, the old Congress passed a bill called the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And the Civil Rights Act actually banned discrimination in public accommodations, meaning if a business is open to the public, it has to accept all the public. It had to take in white people and black people. That was a visionary law. Ahead of its time, that ultimately, unfortunately, was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1883. But a lot of what was included in the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was ultimately included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So it took another 90 years for the United States to pass a bill. That we kind of had passed already back in 1875. So 1876, another presidential election was rolling around, and the Democratic Party sensed victory. They hadn't won a presidential election since James Buchanan back in 1856, so that was 20 years earlier, but things just seemed ripe for a Democratic takeover. We have fatigue with Reconstruction. We had the fact that most of the old Confederacy had been readmitted to the Union, and they had been redeemed. Remember that term from our last video, meaning Reconstruction was over in those states, so it was returned to white majority, white supremacist rule down south. So they sensed victory, and the Democratic Party nominated probably the best person they possibly could nominate for president, a man named Samuel Tilden. Now, Samuel Tilden was the governor of New York, and he had a very good reputation. He was the guy who basically got credit for smashing the Tammany Hall control over New York City, despite the fact that he was a Democrat as well. He was a millionaire lawyer. In fact, he was not married, did not have children, and when he died, he ultimately left his fortune to actually helping to found the New York Public Library. And I'm pretty sure that to this day, the New York Public Library still uses Tilden's estate to actually fund their operations. So Tilden was nominated by the Democratic Party for president. Presumably he would end Reconstruction because all Democrats believe that. The Republicans were divided over who to nominate. President Grant was leaving office. He had served his 2 terms. They debated about this guy and that guy. They thought about James Blaine, who was forgotten about today, but at the time was probably the most prominent politician of the era. He was Speaker of the House for many, many years. He did have a reputation, though, for corruption, so that really harmed him. So ultimately, the Republicans nominated the governor of Ohio, a man named Rutherford Burchard Hayes. So Rutherford Hayes. If you want to Google a picture of Rutherford Hayes, he had the longest beard of any presidential candidate. Hashtag goals. So Tilden and Hayes, this was the choice that voters had in the 1876 election. And Hayes had a reputation of being very honest. Which is what the Republicans needed, really, when they're, after 8 years of Grant and his corruption, or at least his administration's corruption. But despite the fact that Hayes had this honest reputation, he said he favored black rights, but also favored home rule for the South, which is kind of an inconsistent position, really, because if the South runs their own affairs, then black people are not going to have any rights. You needed 185 electoral votes to win the presidential election back then. Tilden got 184. Rutherford Burchard Hayes got 100 and look like a 5. It does that. Got 165. So Tilden was 1 short of victory. Hayes was 20 short of victory. Now, how did this happen? How is there they're not a victor, right? If there's only 2 candidates, one should win. Well, the reason for that is 20 electoral votes were disputed. Excuse me. 20 electoral votes were disputed. Now, how did electoral votes get disputed? Well, those states were South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. So 3 states of the old Confederacy. Now, combined, they had 20 electoral votes. Now, the thing is that the reason why the votes were disputed is that Republicans were still in charge in these states because Reconstruction hadn't ended yet in these 3 states. In 8 of the 11 states the Confederacy had, but in these 3 states it hadn't. And it looked like Tilden got the most votes, but the Republicans who were in charge in those states, said, with credibility, that the only reason it looked like Tilden won these states is because black people were not allowed to vote. They said, therefore, this Tilden's apparent victory in these three states was invalid. And then the Republicans down there, they were doing all sorts of shady stuff. They were, Tilden votes, they were tossing, saying, "Oh, this doesn't count." So there is a big mess. So these 20 electoral votes were going to determine the presidency. Tilden only needed 1. Hayes needed all 20 in order to win the election. So charges of fraud were valid on both sides. The Democrats were right in saying that, Tilden's votes were being tossed. That's not right. But the Republicans were also correct in saying, black people were being intimidated out of voting in these states. Because if they hadn't been, then the Republicans definitely would have won those states free and clear. So Congress decided to appoint an Electoral Commission to decide who would win these 20 electoral votes. an electoral commission. Now, the way it was composed, there were 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents, also 5 members of the House. I'll show you all this. 5 members of the Senate, and 5 Supreme Court justices. So that was the Electoral Commission. So it looked like this commission would be fair, right? Equally distributed among the parties, even though independent, like that really, I don't even know how they considered someone an independent back then, because there really weren't independents. This was actually a very partisan time. People were actually very strongly Democrat or very strongly Republican, which we're going to talk about in subsequent videos why that was. So I think that maybe they considered a lot of the Supreme Court justices to be independent, because Supreme Court justices aren't supposed to rule based on politics. Well, one of the men who was one of the independents and one of the Supreme Court justices was a man named David Davis. What was his mother thinking, right? David Davis was an independent but leaned a little to the Democrats, and he kind of was kind of known as somebody who leaned toward the Democratic Party. So what the Republican Party did was that in January 1877 they got David Davis elected to the United States Senate in his home state of Illinois. So if he took that position, which he did, he would have to resign his spot in the Electoral Commission, because the only reason he was on the Electoral Commission was because he was a Supreme Court justice. So Davis is gone, and the next person that they got to be on the Electoral Commission was a man named Joseph Bradley, another Supreme Court justice. Bradley was a Republican. So now they were pretty much, now there's going to be more Republicans on the electoral commission. Now the thing is that ultimately the Senate ruled, this electoral commission ruled, because this independent thing is really, as we said, really not accurate, because they're really not independents. They were Supreme Court justices, but they had been Republican appointees. So in reality, now with Bradley on the commission and with Bradley tossed, now it was really 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats in reality. Now, so then, shockingly, the Electoral Commission ruled 8-7 to award all 20 disputed electoral votes to Hayes. So that means that now Hayes has 185 electoral votes. Which is exactly the amount he needs to win. So, according to the Electoral Commission, Hayes has been elected president. Now, the Democrats were furious, and Southerners were furious about what had just transpired. They said, "Tilden or blood." Southerners, some of them were actually threatening secession again if Hayes' victory was confirmed. So the House of Representatives, remember, was controlled by the Democrats. According to the Constitution, the House has to certify the presidential election as being like legit. Certify the electoral vote count. And they were threatening not to do that. So the thing is that the Democrats and the Republicans realized that they had to kind of hash this out. This is a really, really messy situation. So they met in a hotel room, Democrats and Republicans, and to try to negotiate some resolution to this. And the Democrats and Republicans, 2 days before the new president was supposed to be sworn in, which was March 4th back then, they came up with a deal, and the deal was known as the Compromise of 1877. Now, the Compromise of 1877 included a bunch of things. One, the Democrats would accept Hayes as being the president. But in return, Hayes would have to appoint a Southerner to be a member of his cabinet. He would have to agree to give federal aid to the South, but the biggest part of the Compromise of 1877 was that Hayes promised that he would end Reconstruction, that he'd remove all the federal troops from the South. Now, this was so important to the Democrats and the Southerners that they agreed. So Hayes became president in return for promising an end to Reconstruction. Now, Southerners promised they would treat black people fairly in return for the end of Reconstruction. But what this basically means is when federal troops are gone, now the South is left to do whatever it wants to do to black people, right? So now black people are left pretty much completely to their own devices in the South. So this was a really, really messy thing. Frederick Douglass, who's the most prominent African American of the era, this is what he said about the end of Reconstruction. When you turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the wind, and worst of all, the wrath of our infuriated masters. Now, are you going to make good on the promises of the Constitution? Frederick Douglass asked white America. But after the 8th Compromise of 1877, it looked like the answer was no, we are not. Reconstruction is now officially over. All right, guys. So hopefully you watch from start to finish. Remember, I want you to watch all these videos from start to finish. And in our next video, we're going to talk about, we're going to just analyze Reconstruction. We're going to talk about the successes, the failures, whether it ever had a chance of succeeding, and what the enormous legacy was of Reconstruction. And Reconstruction got a real reappraisal after the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and 70s, because people were like, well, after civil rights in the 60s, they were like, well, 100 years ago, we were trying to do the same thing. It was called Reconstruction. So we'll talk about the legacy of Reconstruction in depth. All right. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.